First thing that I'd like to do is just, if I could get your name, first and last, and the correct spelling, just so I have it on video.
Okay, I'm Donald E. Foster. It's Donald, D-O-N-A-L-D, Foster, F-O-S-T-E-R.
Thank you. Now, whereabouts did you grow up?
I grew up on a homestead in South Dakota, on the eastern part of the state. That was my grandfather came out with a covered wagon and built a sod hut and settled there, and then he got a quarter section, and then I think he got 2 more before he got through. But my father was born there, and my brother is still there.
Oh, really?
Yes, I'm a middle one of 3 boys, and then we had an older sister over there.
So you're that poor, neglected middle child.
Well, I came back from World War II, and my father had a quarter section of land. That's 160 acres, and he says, I told him, Dad, I'd rather fly a B-17 than drive a farm haul. So he never forgave me for that. Both my brothers stayed there and farmed, and my sister was not a registered nurse.
How did you get involved in the service?
Okay, let's see. I went as a riveter in Lockheed, and they let me go because I had a heart murmur, and then I went to a business college because they said I'd probably die when I was 30, and then so I went to business college. I finished business college, and I was coming up to sign for the draft. I was due, and I said, well, I'll just go on down and see what they can do, and I signed up before. At that time, the draft was 21 to 35. It hadn't dropped to 18 yet in 42. This was about June of 42. So I just went down and enlisted, and they took me and sent me to Fort Sill and made me and I took basic training as an artilleryman in 155 howitzers. Then they sent me to radio school, and I took code. Then they went to a Signal Corps radio maintenance course, so I learned radio maintenance, and then I was sent to the post field where in Fort Sill that flew airplanes. They had these spotting artillery small aircraft, Cubs and Aeronicas and that type, and I maintained the radios on them. And that's when I was up there, and I'd already made sergeant. We made it actually in 9 months. And if you put out half effort, why, you did pretty well. And I would just maintain the radios in these airplanes. And I used to go out and lay out panels, and they'd land on the roads, and sometimes they'd let me fly with them, And I figured, well, if these yahoos can fly, so can I. So that's when I really, but the guy did tell me about the chance to get into the Air Corps from the artillery, but when he told me that let's go up and sign up and go to, it was a junior college, I think in Duncan, Oklahoma or something like that. He told me that's when we'll get down there and we'll fly P-40s and go like that. And that, I went down and we signed up right away and put in for sick call. Instead of going on sick call, I took the test. And I think 3 out of 31 passed. And then I was accepted in the Air Force and went into pilot training.
So before that, you had no, a lot of people dreamed about being pilots forever.
No, I hadn't. I made model airplanes, but they were Navy float planes, carved them out of wood. And I'd ridden once in an old tri-motor Ford airplane with my father. Took off from a wheat field Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and made one big sweep around town. I'm sitting there looking out the side, and he says, "Look at there, downtown. There's Main Street. See it down there?" And landed, and that was about it. And I wasn't too enthusiastic. But after I learned to fly, I loved to fly.
Uh-huh.
It was easy for me on there.
Because you ended up flying 25s or 17s?
B-17s. I went to, they sent us to the University of Missouri. I was there for 5 months and got 15 credits in geopolitics and physics and science, and I had no problems at all. I'd gone to a one-room school with 30 students and one teacher in all 8 grades, and I went that way for 8 years and went to high school with about 36 in the class, and I went to the University of Missouri and never had any problems with mathematics at all, and then from there we went into pre-flight, and I took my primary training in Stamford, Texas, which was right near where the WASPs were training, the women pilots were training. They were at Coleman, I think, Texas, or Sweetwater, I think was the name of the field. And we were at Stamford, which was just a little ways away from there. But I never did get over there. And then took basic at Denison, Texas, and that's where I flew the BT-13, which was a Vultee vibrator, an all-metal airplane, and fixed gear. I can remember some of the traffic patterns would be 100 airplanes lined out this way out for 10 miles. You'd fight to get your place in there, and they'd fly for 2 hours and come back, and then they'd all take off again on there. It was crowded.
So this is just plane after plane after?
After plane, yeah. It was about 200 in the pattern at the time. And they trained us, and the washout rate was 52% on there. They used to line us up against the wall and say, there's only going to be 3 of you left after next week. Sure enough, there's only 3 of us left out of there. And it was pretty thorough, actually. And by the time we had went to advanced training, I went to twin engine, multi-pilot training, multi-engine training, and we had one instructor for instruments. By that time, they'd realized that the Air Force had needed instrument pilots so you could fly in England. And then we did that. And then from there, I went to B-17 transition and then picked up a crew at Lincoln, Nebraska. And you want me to keep it pretty brief? Yeah. Then we went to Sioux City, Iowa. Yep.
When was the first time you flew a B-17? Do you remember getting in it?
Oh, yeah. I remember going and looking at that big thing, and they had to check the hole outside of it, and make sure that all the Zeus fasteners are in tight, and there's no leaks on the airplane, yeah, it was. But other people were flying them, so if they can fly them, I figured I could fly them too. That was always my attitude: is I can do as good as anybody else. And then we picked up the crew and we flew out of Sioux City, Iowa, and it was winter time in the end of '44, and it blizzard, and I think they had 7 airplanes crash in 1 week. I'd come in and I refused to land at Sioux City and went to Chicago and landed. When I came back and looked, and there was an airplane that was crashed. It was right in the fireman's fire station with this big tail hanging up in the air and a parachute hanging down, and it was it was cold. The Air-17 wasn't very tight, and they'd have to shovel the snow out with a scoop shovel when the wind blew and drifted. It would drift full of snow in the front. I know we'd have to brush all the snow off the seats and open a hole with an Altus lamp. We'd burn a hole with the light, signal lamps and Altus lamps, and we'd burn a hole, look at that to see to take off. And it would be, 10 below zero and get up in the air, and it's a constant minus 59 when you get above 30,000. And it was cold, and we didn't have... The instructors are the only ones that had the heated suits when we went there. And I can remember him sitting there in his seat and steam coming out from under the back of his trousers. Jesus, he's cozy, and I'm sitting there with these leather boots and they have sheepskin jackets and woolen underwear trying to keep warm. And my hands used to get cold. It was terrible. And they gave you the whole inside of the airplane would be white with frost about that thick if you stayed up for any period of time, and the throttles were steel, and your fingers would stick to them if you didn't. And they gave us silk gloves. I should have brought them. I have a pair at home. So your fingers wouldn't stick if you had to do some work on anything inside the airplane. It wouldn't stick to it. But that was just in training, and the airplanes weren't in too good a shape. I remember going out to fly one time, and the form said, the gear won't retract. And I said to the instructor, I said, geez, we don't want to take this airplane. He says, oh, go on ahead. We'll give your flight engineer training on how to retract the gear. and I remember it took 800 turns into Bombay for him to pull up the gear. It was a crank like this on there, and it took forever to get it up. And you come back down, you had to let them back down. They didn't pre-fall like the newer airplanes on that. And it was cold, and the snow was all over the place. And then we left and went to Topeka, Kansas, and picked up a brand new airplane. And it only had 14 hours on it, and we took a test out. And so help me, we flew that and couldn't find a thing wrong with it. Couldn't find a thing wrong with it. It was brand new, and I think it was built by Douglas. It wasn't a Boeing, because a lot of other planes built B-17s. Lockheed built B-17s also. And they then we took off and went to Bangor, Maine, and they gave us our overseas equipment, binoculars and 45s and blankets and the whole thing. And then we flew up to Gander, Newfoundland. I can still remember. We couldn't tell whether it was Gander, Newfoundland, or Goose Bay. We was arguing there with my 19-year-old navigator. So we finally decided we'd go to that one, and it was there. And the snow was piled up as higher in this room, and it had pine trees stuck over there so you get a little depth perception. They stuck them in the snow. And we landed in Newfoundland, and by this time it's in December, almost January of '45. It's near the end of the war, but we zoomed in there, and we were there for 2 weeks waiting for a tailwind so we could make it to our next destination. And we didn't know where we were going. It was a secret thing. And they never knew about the jet stream at that time. And we waited until we got a good tailwind. So we took off, we opened up this big brown envelope, and you could either go to the Azores or you'd go to England. And we opened it up, and we were going to Bally, Wales, actually. And it was an 11-hour flight. We had a Do-17 with Tokyo tanks, little extra tanks on the tips. And we got there, and I almost messed up. I got a crosswind, and when I went to home in on the radio, I didn't correct for the drift, so I just kind of came on around into the wind, and we only didn't have much gas. And I remember we got in there, the WAF came out and says, who's going to guard the airplane? And of course, we'd use the autopilot, and we always called it George. I said, well, George flew it over. George can guard it. So we all left the airplane and went into the ops. And then from there, we went to Marrakech. And that's when we had to dodge, couldn't fly over Italy. Over France. No, wait a minute. That was later on. That was when we left Oran. But we got to Marrakech. They were all Arabs there, and it was a French base at that time. They had A-20s, and then we flew up. My 19-year-old navigator, when we left Gander, we took off about 3 in the morning so we could arrive at daylight in Wales. And he said he threw up and had diarrhea and he couldn't navigate. And we'd gone through icing climbing up, and I said, well, I'm not going to go back. He said, well, just follow the flight plan. They make good flight plans. And it was because the Transport Command was running it. And so help me, we just followed the flight plan, and my bombardier made drifts with the bomb sight. And we hit the place going over. And then the same 19-year-old navigator, took off from Marrakech, headed for Iran, and he says, comes up to me and held out a map. He said, "There's something wrong with this map. These mountains aren't supposed to be in front of us. They're supposed to be over on the left." And I said, "Well, check your heading." And we found out he was 30 degrees off on the heading. So, and then we plowed on down to Oran, and we spent the night there. And then from there, and that's when we, I think we had to watch out. They wouldn't let us arm the guns, and we weren't allowed to fly over Spain. I remember that. We had to dodge Spain. And we went to Italy, and we landed at Gioia. And there was a recovery base, and and we were sitting in a tent, and they were going to pick us up from the bomb group. And in the afternoon, the missions would all come back, and all the airplanes that had damaged, that they didn't want to leave them at the air base, and this was a big depot. This was a main depot for the airplanes. They come rolling in there in the afternoon, and they'd land with gear up and skid around, and they'd run out with a big derrick and hook on it and carry it out. And some of them, they couldn't get the ball turret reversed, and I remember one of them hitting the ground, and the turret was rolling right alongside the airplane, you know. Of course, no one was in it, and they got out. And it was kind of an amusement there. Of course, we were kind of wondering what in the world we gotten into, you know, by then. And then they picked us up. They went to a bomb group, and we went to the second bomb group, which is on Manfredonia, about halfway between Foggia and the Adriatic Sea. And we were at Amendola, and it was we all lived in 6-man tents. And of course, there were 4 officers. The officers lived in their tents, and the enlisted men were in another area. Our crew members were down. They were close. They were down by the mess hall, the enlisted mess. And we went to the officers' club, and it was made out of shell boxes. They'd made it all out of shell boxes. It was a big, nice, and they had tufi block that was made out of this soft sandstone. They'd saw out these blocks and make homes, and some of them even jazzed up their tents. We had a brick floor they took out of some Italian's house, and we kept warm by, we had a barrel half full of sand, and then they had a pipe that come in it, and then they had a tip tank from a P-38 sitting up on the rack outside the tent. And the cooks used regular kerosene, I think, for their cook stoves in the kitchen. And they come around and they would fill up these tip tanks for us to keep us warm in these tents. So we had a whole bunch of tents, and of course every squadron, we had probably 60 airplanes and probably close to 100 crews in each one of these places. Everybody we'd split up the crew, 2 tents. There was 4 officers in a tent, in a 6-man tent. You'd get 2 crew members from one tent, and then the other would have all 4. But it was, and the toilet was a slit trench back in the back, kind of down the lower end of the place away from us. And the urinals were just the eave spouts stuck in the ground, and you walked up to an eave spout for a urinal. And we took a bath under an old sprinkler system on it, sitting on an old cart. That's if it warmed up enough, we did. We didn't always take a bath. And we slept on camp cots, these folding canvas camp cots, and we each had a sleeping bag that they gave us at Bangor, Maine. We used a sleeping bag and a blanket, and no sheets and anything else. And we ate at the mess, and they cooked sea rations mostly for the men. You had spam fried, spam baked, spam boiled, you know, every which way. And then they had a lot of times they give you cans of cheese, and we would get bread from the mess hall and make cheese sandwiches and toast them on our stove in the area there. And then, of course, on days off, if you didn't fly, you censored mail. And they used to censor, we'd have to censor most of the enlisted men's mail that was going out. And then we always had one we all fought for. Maybe I didn't tell you, they're students, you can cut it out. But they evidently had, she was telling him about all her boyfriends she was going out with, and he was telling her about all the girls he was going out with, and we used to fight to get his letters. And then, of course, and other things in downtime, he wrote the letters for the crew members that had been downed on the previous day or two, and if they thought you knew them, why then you'd get assigned to the thing. It's generally another pilot wrote a letter on a pilot, the navigator wrote a letter on the navigator.
So was it usually somebody you knew, or was it they just kind of assumed?
Well, they assumed we knew him. And I often think of some of those letters, he was a great pilot, he could fly good formation, and he was holding good formation when he was hit, I often think about the folks, I don't know what they thought of the letters. Then the ops officer would sign them. We didn't sign them for that. And but on the missions, my navigator was kind of he was 19, and he would go to other airplanes and get flak suits, and the navigator sat in a little, like a secretary's chair, just a small chair in the front, and he had a workbench for his table. And he'd go to other airplanes and put them underneath to protect his bottom in the airplane. Of course, we had pretty good steel seats up there where we were, and they were kind of a coffin shaped. I've never seen much of them on the airplanes. They must just take them out, but you could back into them a little bit, and you had a little protection, but you couldn't fly formation with that. But actually, let's see, any other questions you had, or am I rambling here?
No, you're right on with because it's giving me kind of the flavor of what it was. So
it's down to earth. I mean, it wasn't any hoopla. We didn't. We knew the targets pretty well over there, and I know Vienna was one target, and they used to, every time they'd say we're going to go to Vienna, the guys would throw their hat on the floor and say, "Oh, doggone it, there's the way we have to go today," and they'd brief us for 400 guns. And when the war ended, they found 800 guns there. We wondered why they always were so deadly with their flak, because the flak, most of the anti-aircraft was run by women, because all the men were in the Russian front and the Western front, and the women manned most of the guns, believe it or not. Huh. The anti-aircraft, just roll them in there, and they just make a big black pattern in front of you, like a wall, just like a wall. And you go through it and rattle, and like kids throwing stones on a culvert, you could hear it. Because the airplane wasn't lined. It was pretty thin-skinned. And but then, the typical mission, I'll just take you on one. They would get you up about 4 o'clock in the morning, and you go have breakfast. And if it was a pretty rough target, you couldn't hardly get into the chaplain would hold a brief prayer for them, and everybody'd fill up the chapel, and they'd fill them up. And there were 2 B-17 groups that flew off of this airfield, the 97th and the 2nd Bomb Group. We would one take turns going first. And you generally flew around 30 to 45 airplanes every time. You had 4 squadrons, and probably generally at least 7 in a box, and then you sent up spares. And but we'd get down and we'd all get in a 6-by truck. We didn't have Jeeps like they did in the 8th Air Force. And we'd drive them a long ways down, way to the edge of where we were setting, and then they'd have a general briefing. That's when the wing commander got up, and they peeled back the shades, and the intelligence officer had all the lines drawn, and this is where you're going, and so forth. And then the co-pilot and the gunners would go down to the airplane and in another set of planes, and they'd have specialized briefing for the targets, for the pilot and the bombardier and the navigator. And that's where they really got down to the roots and where their aiming points were and what to look for. Because we always did daylight bombing. The British bombed at night, but they just bombed area. And we were never allowed to drop bombs unless we could see the target. And many times we've had to turn around and back and go through again and take another beating because they couldn't see the targets. The clouds didn't have any holes in them or anything. Of course, we crossed the Alps too. They were up 24,000 feet at Mont Blanc. So the weather would build up pretty high there. So I know one of my first mission was about 30,000 feet in the B-17. It was, we were up there. The 24s were then below us under there. They ran around 26,000 feet as a rule. But anyway, getting back to the mission, we'd all go, and then we'd all beat out the airplane, and the gunners would go out, and a lot of them would re-string their ammunition, and then others would just check them to make sure that the belts wouldn't jam. You know, if you get a round sticking out, it won't go through the belt, and then the guns jam. So some of them would really go over theirs real bad. I made most of mine. Well, of course, I wasn't there. My co-pilot made them make sure that all the ammunition was good before they flew, and then the bombs were already generally loaded, unless they changed the mission, and then it was a fiasco. But then the three officers would come out, and we'd all get in the airplane, and they'd shoot a flare. Everybody would start their engines. All 30 or 40 airplanes would start their engines, and this dust would just fly. And the runway was not paved; it was a dust. It was made out of tufi block or stone, and you knew where you were in the position and where the planes were parked. That was told to you before. So you followed them out. You stayed up close so that you would keep his dust down, you could blow it out. And then as soon as he took off, you went off right after him. None of this wait until they cleared the runway. You just took off, and the prop wash was terrible. Sometimes you'd sit there, your stick all the way over this way, and his wash would be pushing down, and then once you go through it, and then you'd have to get back. And these airplanes, you remember, loaded to the gills you had 12 50 caliber machine guns on there, on the airplane, and they had all the ammunition for each one of them, and you generally carried about 6,000 pounds of bomb, and you were filled with gasoline all the way, 120 octane. Anyway, you'd take off, and then the big game was to find your lead airplane, and he generally went up straight ahead, and then the others, if you were in the first flight, he'd shoot a red one, and maybe the other lead ship would have a green one over here, and then you'd go over to them and fall in. And if you always had 3 airplanes, and this 1, 2, 3, and then you had 3 underneath. Then it'd be 4, 5, and 6, and then maybe 1 in the back, number 7. That's where the new crews went, and it was a rat, and they'd be screaming all around, getting rendezvoused, and by that time it was daylight, and it was just a steady stream, one right after the other on the takeoff.
Are you having to?
You
once
went
you
straight
get up,
ahead.
Are you headed and jockeying in position, or do they have to circle around?
They generally turned so you could catch them. That way, they always generally made a left turn because the pilots are on the left side, and they always generally made a left turn, and we generally get into position by the time you got turned on around, and then we would just get into formation, and then we'd go over the P-38s were up the road between us and Germany and northern Italy. We were still bombing Milan when I was there, and we'd come over, and it would just infuriate them because it would wake them up because fighters didn't have to go, for another 2 or 3 hours. And so when they would come home early, they'd come around and they would blow tents over with the P-38. They could do it too. I've had them have mine blown over, and I just went over and got another tent and put it on top of the one I had. But I'm getting back to the mission. Then then it was a climb. The airplane, you climbed about 145 to 150 miles an hour, and you leveled off. You went about 155 on there. It was just a tedious grind. I don't think we climbed over 300 feet a minute. It was long. Barely get it up to altitude before you. Like the 8th, they used to have to circle, I think, before they went across the thing. But we had a little distance. But then you got near the enemy thing, and then you'd test fire the guns, and at 10,000 feet, you went on oxygen. And then you sent the bombardier back, and he pulled the pins out of the bombs. And one guy caught his bombardier, didn't pull them out, so he had him put them in a baking powder can and bring them back every time. That's another crew. But we have them clear the guns. And I remember the first time they cleared the guns, and I was sitting there, and bang, I got hit on the head, and I thought, boy, the Germans got me. And I looked, and it was a darn light, a BAP light from the ceiling had dropped down on my head on there. And but then you went on oxygen, and of course you had an oxygen check every 15 minutes. And the tail gunner was all by himself in the back. And the co-pilot had a little round dial over here to see whether he's breathing or not. When he breathed, the lips would open and then close. It was like a shutter on a camera or something. I mean, you could see him breathing on there. So, and that way you kept tab on the tail gunner. The other gunners were together. You could see them. And the radio operator was by himself, but he generally would. He had a nice seat and a good place to sit. Yeah. The other guys in the back didn't. And then that's when the ball turret operator would get down into the ball turret after, generally before you got up to high altitude, in case you kept, because you only live about 3 minutes without a hose, without oxygen. You know, it's real quick. And they, of course, the 17 had a high pressure system. It about 300 pounds, and it was just like dynamite if you hit one of them with a bullet, and it would burn and flame. And if you had a leak, it would go in a hurry too. But they'd all get on oxygen and get into position, and then when you crossed into the enemy territories, and when you started looking around, and that's when we had a wing commander that used to get up in the lead airplane, and he'd get in the tail gunner position. He'd call everybody out by name, and he'd say, "Okay, Foster, get in there closer, get in there closer." And he'd say, "Okay, there, Forney, you ought to get in. Don't lag in there. What's the matter? You afraid?" And you'd practically run your wing right behind the other guy's wing, and close, and especially, and then when you saw him, and then you, of course, headed out for your targets. And I'll just say we were heading over to, one was Wiener Neustadt. I remember that one, and I liked the name, and we'd go on that, and you could always see where the target was, because then there was already flak there. As I said, they didn't wait until you get there. They'd be up there in this black from there, and you couldn't take evasive action. You just had to fly through it. And then you were getting fighters. By the time I got there, the Germans had Me-262 jet fighters, and they could come right up and they'd shoot right up all the way through your formation. They'd turn around, they'd shoot down on the whole formation, and they only flew about 20 minutes down there. That was just it was a little twin-engine jet, and they would fire at us. And I remember one of them, the gunners shot a jet down, and the wing commander had his gunner fly with him every time they went in from that, and he lost his gunner. But the wing commander would keep us in tight formation, and of course when the fighters come, it was really probably the worst was when they'd line up 6 abreast and come straight at you, right straight in front at you, and by that time they were lobbing rockets near the end of the war, and then you could see these little white streaks coming over there, and nothing you could do was just hold formation. You couldn't really swing 20 or 30 airplanes around at all over there, so you just went through it and hoped everything kept going. And I never did get hurt on there. I had crew members get hurt, but I never got a scratch.
Because your plane could take quite a bit, couldn't it? I mean, in the flat.
It had self-sealing fuel tanks in the B-17. They were rubber tanks with a fluid in the middle, and if you penetrated, the fluid would go in there and hit the gasoline and solidify and seal. They were self-sealing tanks. And the only thing that you couldn't stop was if they used high explosive or the red flak. You've heard of the red flak. I'm sure you have.
But I assume it's an incendiary.
There was a high explosive flaks. You know, the fighters, I know, and the gunners, we used to, I think every fourth round was a incendiary round. They could see where their bullets were going. You could see them, and they found out it didn't really make any difference. But anyway, after you, then you generally got through the flak, and that's probably about when you released the bombs. And there was always a big relief, because you knew if you lost an engine or maybe two, you could at least stay with them for a while, you know, over there. And there was no big jump up or anything when the bombs left, because most of the time you trailed them out like every 30 feet, you know, and 50 feet. And you had a mixed load as a rule. You'd use high explosive bombs, and you'd mix incendiaries with them so that the rubble would burn. And then just to make it exciting, they'd probably be 2 or 3 time delay bombs. So when the fire department got in there, then they'd go off. They had about three types sometimes on one mission on there, just to annoy them. But anyway, you'd swing around and come back and count the airplanes and fill in if there were any holes. And then you
Reshape your formation.
yeah, get in tight. Well, you held them up. Well, you flew your tightest formation when you went on a target, because the whole box maybe of the 7 airplanes, you always bombed off the lead airplane, and that's the one that the German fighters went after. It was always the lead ship, because that was the best bombardier that had the best CE or circular air. And some of them had circular airs around 1,000 feet, or less than 1,000 feet, you know. Mine was that. He was pretty good. And they would, we just huddled up close, and when his bomb doors opened, they'd open our bomb doors. And if he got hit, the lead ship, the other one, number 2, was the deputy lead, and he'd move over in to the center, and we'd drop off of him. And towards the end of the war, later on, they used tech sergeants just to toggle them off the lead ship. But that was later on. See, I got over there later than the 43, where the 8th sent them over unescorted, and they really took a beating. But it was bad enough for me. I always felt grateful that I got back. But anyway, we'd whip around and head for home over there. And if they had wounded aboard, they were allowed to leave the formation and streak back if they could over there. And after you got over there, we had, and believe it or not, we were escorted by the 99th Fighter Group, which was the all black Negro group. The Tuskegee Airmen were in Italy, you know, and they were good escorts. I don't think we lost any airplanes due to fighters, but of course, our fighters and their fighters always peeled off when the flak came up, because they didn't want to fight in the middle of the flak, you know. But then we'd all come back and come over the field and peel off, and get behind one. You land right behind one another. You didn't always wait for them to clear the runway. You land behind them, and that's just something what it's like. And then you'd go back and you'd debrief. You get free whiskey if you wanted it. Old Overshoe, the old whiskey, the Overholt, I think it was, but they called it Old Overshoe. And they would interrogate you on how many airplanes you saw, and how many flaks were, and where the guns were, and then you'd go back. Trucks would be there, and you'd go back on a 6x truck. And we had about a 3-mile ride. The airfield was quite a ways away from where we lived.
How long was a
8.5-hour mission.
That's
Every mission was 8.5 hours roughly. Yeah, you flew formation for 8.5 hours. The co-pilot could fly formation too, especially but on the bomb run it was always the pilot and the bombardier, because the bombardier, you could put it on autopilot, which the lead ship generally did, and the bombardier could steer the airplane, and he ran the autopilot through his bomb sight, and he put the crosshairs on, and he could run it. They generally could make a better bomb run by doing that than having the pilot follow what they call the PDI, pilot data indicator, which is and those old airplanes, the bomb, the initial point is where you, last point, then you go from there straight to the target. That's the way we bombed. And some of them would take 3 minutes. That was just like hell for 3 minutes. You had to you couldn't do anything but just hold your position and keep so the bomb pattern would be close when down where they're bombing. 'Cause we were bombing a lot of rail yards when I was there, and even some bridges and something. We were even doing frontline bombing when the time I was there.
So as a pilot, what was, at that point when you're over the target dropping the bombs, what are you looking at?
Do the pilot?
Yeah.
He has a time to go indicator, and it tells you how many minutes or seconds till bomb's away, and two things would just come over and cross, and then the bomb light would come on. And then he had a needle on the top of the dial for right or left, and if the bombardier put in corrections, the needle would move, and the pilot could follow it in. Unless you had it tied into autopilot, then the bombardier would make the turn. But you could still see the needle move when he was changing his settings on the bomb sight.
How did you avoid not, I mean, I think if I saw flak coming at me, there would be that natural tendency to...
Try to do a breakaway and make evasive action. No, you were trained to just, your mission was to drop the bombs on the target. And if you didn't, well, it was just a waste of time to come up there. And no, it was no even thought of doing anything different. You had to stay with the squadron. They needed your guns for protection, and you need to get your bombs in there, because that's the whole purpose of the thing, was bombs on the target, have this drilled into you.
And you said you carried about how many pounds?
Around 6,000 mostly.
And roughly how many bombs is that?
Well, if they were 100-pounders, it'd be 60. For 500-pounders, there'd be, 20? No, 5 into 60. 120.
Huh.
And
now, I've always seen, newsreel photos, and it shows the guys riding on the bombs. And is that movies or is that reality?
No, they did. Some of them put the kitchen sink in there. Is that what you mean?
Well, they put
Well, they used to, I remember tying the kitchen sink on. They said you drop everything but the kitchen sink, and then some reason they'd give them the kitchen sink too. They take a sink off an old wrecked house, had one tied on there, and let it drop off. Yeah, they had some obscenities on some of them on there. Yeah, they I don't know. They were able to. They had chalk and things they wrote with.
Now you're flying at, what did you say, 30,000?
30,000. Sometimes 29. Sometimes.
Can you make out buildings from that height?
Not anything big. No, that's 5 miles.
That's what I thought. So once you let your bombs go, do you actually see?
Yes, bombs are going the same speed you are, and they follow you for quite a ways before they go straight down, because they're going 150 miles an hour too, and they all go down in a kind of a loop, and that's actually just behind you. They used to call that the trail distance. They computed that to make allowance for that on your ballistics. They call that the trail, and that's where the bombs would be land a little bit behind your airplanes. And if you're in a later group, you could probably see it. And sometimes the smoke would come up to 10,000 feet too if you hit an oil refinery and just turn black down there. Especially if you turned and you could look out and see. But most of the time, I was more interested in holding formation. I never looked out.
You were just dealing with.
I was going to shake hands with the gunner over in the other airplane. That put your wing right behind the wing of the other airplane. Yeah.
Wow. Huh. So did every mission, did you take photographs? Did they photograph your bombs?
Yeah, they had, what do they call it, IBDA, Initial Bomb Damage Assessment. They had, not all airplanes had it. Certain airplanes would have a camera aboard over there, and they would take pictures. And it was, I think, it had an intervalometer, and I think it was the bombardier ran it from the front. And he set it with the interval of his bombs, I think, on there. You could see the bombs leave the airplanes, of course, when they were around you, and but they flew down pretty good. They had little propellers on them, on there. But
a powered propeller or a propeller that just.
the wind blew it, and it turned a screw, and that armed the bombs. You see, the bombs they're in there, and they had a little fuse you put on them. And then it had a little counter key that held it. And like I told you, the bombardier would go back there and pull those pins out of these fuses. And after he did that, they were armed. You assumed they were armed because sometimes the wind would make them turn into bomb bay. And then when they go out, this propeller screws, and it used to screw a tube into some acetone, I think it is, and it would cut through, and that would arm the bomb on there. Oh yeah, the bombs before they pulled the pins, they used to treat them just like cordwood. I've seen them drive up beside the airplane and open the gate on the truck and kick them out the back, and then put the fins on them, and that's. In fact, my first open post, I went off the base. I rode up on a load of bombs in the truck.
Because I imagine in the plane when you say, "Okay, pull the pins," and now you're armed. I mean.
From that on, you assume you're armed. The flight engineer always went back to make sure that you could have a hang bomb, and that's happened, and he could go back and lots of times trigger it off with a screwdriver on the bomb shackle. They had shackles, and you could just put a screwdriver in there and give it a twist and then drop it out.
You're just a big fireworks stand in the sky.
Oh yeah, if they hit you just right, the whole airplane would blow too.
Did you ever? Because some of the targets you were bombing were where?
In Vienna was one of our worst ones, and then we bombed the ones where they were working on the nuclear was up in Norway. We never bombed there. The 8th Air Force was after the heavy water plants up there. We had mostly the jets, and some of the places where they made the buzz bombs was down around in our area. And I'm trying to think of Wiener Neustadt. Munich was quite a transportation center. I hit mostly, and there was quite a bit of production there too. And Munich, Wiener Neustadt, Milan. We were hitting northern Italy, Milan. We were just north of Pisa, just in that area. And when we hauled gasoline, I landed at that field that they're still using in Italy. It was just a dirt field. We landed in an open field in a B-17. About 20 or 30 of us, and these had jerry cans in this B-17 full of gasoline. And the British were on the east side of Italy, and the Americans were on the west side of Italy. And these big Indian Sikhs came out with these big high turbans and swords, and they were the ones that unloaded these 5-gallon cans out of the bomb bay. We had a rack in the bottom of the bomb bay, and they were unloading them. And I remember they wanted to quit and make tea. They would hit about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and they pulling up grass and making a fire, and they're going to tea. I finally got them to unload so I could get out of there. I didn't want to stay there too long.
Did you ever go after the war, at the end of the war, and check out any of your craft work?
Oh,
your
yeah.
handiwork?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. I stayed there. I got a Dear John from my fiance, and on my 10th mission, and when the war ended, I said, I'm not going home. And I didn't go home till 47. So we stayed in Italy till about December of 46. And then I went up to Germany in 47. Now, when the war ended, the first thing we did when the war ended was to pick up PWs. And I did fly up into Germany, and we did get to fly over the Belgian and those concentration camps, and you could smell them at 10,000 feet. It was terrible. They're just rotten, sweet odor of death. But we picked up American PWs and then took them down to Africa. Istres, France. Anyway, they fattened them up because all the American PWs weighed about 120 pounds. They were just barely making it over there. They looked real pitiful, and they were tickled to death to see us. And we just put a bunch of benches in the B-17 and took them on down. And that was the very first mission we had when the war ended, was to get the PWs out of there. And then we got a sightseeing tour, and like I said, I flew right through these concentration camps, and then I got to see all the rubble. Mainz was a town next to Wiesbaden, and 80% of the roofs of all the towns, the whole town was gone. I don't know, the British, I don't know if they retaliated on something or other. Sometimes they would do that. They area bombed at night. We couldn't sometimes if we couldn't see the target, we never dropped the bombs. We never tried to hit any civilians unnecessarily. That was the whole theme of the war. And we did salvo bombs in the Lake Como, north of Milan. Was one place where if we couldn't drop the bombs, we did have targets of opportunity, but sometimes they'd be weathered in too. And you always almost had to have clear weather to daylight bomb when on there. And that was and they were getting radar before the end of the war, but I don't think the 8th Air Force had more than we did on that.
So you wouldn't, if you couldn't drop them, you sure didn't want to bring them home with you?
No, not after you pull the pins. No, you never landed with a bomb on. If you did, you'd have all the fire trucks meet you or something. If you had one hung, generally the flight engineer could figure out how to kick them out on there.
What was the toughest position of your crew, do you think?
Well, the most effective gunner was a ball turret gunner. They got more kills. I think the gunners got more German airplanes than the fighter pilots, but they weren't escorted during 43, and that was before I got over there. But our ball turret was one of our key gunners, and they also the head-on, the chin turret with the bombardier. What do you mean the most critical crew member?
Well,
we had a pilot, co-pilot, navigator, and bombardier. That was the 3 officers, and a lot of them were warrant officers. Half of my class were blue. They had the blue pin on their thing instead of a lieutenant. They weren't lieutenants; they were warrant officers. And some crews were all warrant officer, blue bars we used to call them. Yeah, blue bars. And half of my class was blue bars. They weren't officers; they were warrant officers. But now that was the 4 crew members were the pilot, co-pilot, and navigator, bombardier. And then they had the flight engineer. He was next. He ran the enlisted men as a rule. Mine was about 21, a big Finn from northern Minnesota. And then you had the radio operator was the next. These were specially trained people. They could take code and make strike reports and things like that. Mine, he was the doozy on the crew. He was hard to manage and young, immature. And he was from Cleveland, Ohio. My ball turret operator was a little this cool one from West Virginia over there. I can remember where they're from rather than their names. And the two waist gunners, the one that shot out the windows, and all their ammunition casings would be on the floor of the airplane in the back because they didn't go out. The other turrets, most of the shells and casings would leave the airplane, but they'd be walking around in casings back there. And I forget, one was from Michigan, I think, and the other one was from Florida. And then my tail gunner was, I think he was from California. Oh, the mixed crew, you know.
So you kept the same crew all the time then?
No, they split us up once in a while. I trained with the crew, and when I came over, I only brought over the radio operator and the flight engineer, minimum crew, because that's what you needed to get across the water. And then and then I picked up the rest of the crew when I got over there because they didn't have that many crew losses. And I think some of them were taking second tours too. They wanted to get more stripes or whatever. Some of them just loved it, you know. Loved that fear, I guess.
Boy, no thank you.
But that was it. I stayed there, and they deactivated the group. We flew some. Our biggest worry was Yugoslavia, and we had some show of force demonstrators, durations. We flew over Yugoslavia with a big bunch of B-17s and fly down low and open the bomb bays and put the fear in them and come back and land. And that's a show of force. That was things they did then days. And because I can remember getting briefed over there about Yugoslavia was a good place to go if you got shot down. But the only thing is there was 5 different factions. I remember 3 of them. There was Mikhailovich and Tito and another couple of others. And they always said that if you got shot down, you know, you had blood chits where they could get money from anybody that they brought. We give them chits from our, we had a kit, we had a survival kit and had that in there, American flag and whatever. And they always say, go with the team that's winning and don't do any shooting, and then you get out of there. But don't try to be a hero and protect the guys that you're with. Run off and hide. That was the first time I ever heard of brainwashing. It was when I got to Italy. When I got up, one of my first orientations was, now remember, the Italians are not your enemy. They're your co-belligerents. And so from then on, all they did was steal from us all the time we were there. And we called them our co-belligerents.
What was the best part of being in the service?
The best part? I guess flying and making a low approach and a good landing, I guess, and completing your missions when you flew was probably, to me, was the best part of the service.
What was it?
Of course, after World War II, I mean, you go through all that, and anything else you do in your life is probably anticlimactic, except getting married and having children. The children are born, probably, and there's nothing that probably would top it. You know, nothing's really important. I mean, you got through that, and but you savor life, I think, a lot more after going through that.
What was the hardest part?
Probably the hardest part was seeing who's lost after every mission, seeing the empty tents. You'd go up there and the tents would be empty, and be picking up their personal belongings and trying to keep the Italians from stealing. They seemed to know which ones got shot down. You've probably heard that before.
Well, I did. I heard that some of you guys were kind of, well, I guess it was part of war, but kind of cold. That if you heard somebody was missing before you really found out they were gone, you were stealing their blankets.
Yeah, we didn't do that. It was the Italians, but it was so bad that it used to have an officer duty for give you a 45 with buckshot, and if you saw an Italian in the officer's area, you shot him with buckshot. And I can remember yelling and banging and yelling over there. We kept them out of there. They did have one incident where the Axis Sally called us up one day and told us that our clock was off in the briefing room. and then they flew one mission, and she told them where they were going. We're going to be there to meet you. We got the best of the German Air Force to meet you. And they found out it was one of the cooks in the mess hall. And they shot him right on the spot. That was the end of it. It was done.
Wow.
And but it was kind of disheartening to hear that, when you're flying. Of course, there's lighter moments. I can remember one of my first flights. You flew as a co-pilot till you got checked out. They wanted to see if you could fly formation, and if you were a good pilot, could land, and they gave you a field check, and that meant flying as a co-pilot with another crew for probably about 2 or 3 missions, and then you would take your own crew, And I got in there, and this guy gets up there, and he says, well, crank in Radio Europe, or, they had the radio stations. And geez, I turned it in here. And we're climbing out in formation. And here comes the Andrews sisters singing, drinking rum and Coca-Cola. And I said, God, this is pretty good. You got music while we're going up here.
Yeah, it is interesting because there still is real life within war. I mean, the things
you live. Yeah, you live. It's, but it is, but you go at a fast pace in combat. Even in Vietnam, I went 7 days a week. You never had a weekend off. I mean, every day, no let up at all. No holidays or anything. And even when I was in Vietnam, I was that way. And but in World War II, you'd been steamed up, and then you're just going, and almost the bottom dropped out because you'd gone at full speed. It felt like you were just going at full speed, And then when the war ended, it was nothing.
Now I'm going to ask it might be a sensitive subject here. The Dear John letter. Now that's cool. Now was your fiance that wrote it?
Yeah, she had my diamond, and she married and I can always remember the opening sentence. This hurts me more than it hurts you. It took me a while to get over it. It was, and she married a merchant seaman too, and they'd got a lot of money. They were the money men, in World War II. They might be heroes, but they made a lot of money on them ships.
We switch tapes here.
Is anything else? And I had taken a class in psychology. I was working on a master's degree, and the guy asked me, he says, well, how does it feel? How does it feel to be in combat? And I said, well, first you start off, you just get scared as you all get out. Next thing you know, you just get mad. And it's just about what it happens, about the time and then you run along on that madness or till you get through it,
Is that kind of the driving force once you get over there?
Yeah, what do you call it? Adrenaline. The adrenaline seems to work that way. You cease being scared and you just become angry, kind of, call them bad names and everything else.
Who did you, when you went over, who did you think your enemy was? I mean, did you think it was a person or a nation or what?
Well, yeah, it was we figured the Germans were our enemy, and we'd been seeing anti-war pictures from '39, from the time Hitler ran through Poland. I finished high school; he took over Austria, and and I don't think we had heard about their concentration camps before then. But yeah, we didn't hear. We wanted them to quit, and you wanted them to. All I could was think about was to hurt them enough to stop, keep them from continuing the war, is the way you felt about it. I don't think there was anything personal. They were people too, doing what they were told to do. I mean, I don't really hold it as a race. I don't hold it against them at all.
Did you have German prisoners where you were?
After the war.
After the war.
I ran a construction crew. I made regular in the Army as a signal officer, because pilots are nothing but truck drivers to the Army, and they could use them for anything they wanted. So when the war ended, I ran a signal. Of course, I'd been a radio mechanic, or radio, so they said, "Oh, you know communications." And I had a German major that had a construction crew, and we put in ground cables and landlines for a big 11,000-foot airfield around Foggia, Italy. That was part of our crowding up on Russia at that time. But I was a second lieutenant still. No, I was the first by then. I was the first lieutenant, and he did everything I told him to, and he made the guys jump. I had a lot of respect for him for that.
Did you have to use an interpreter, or did they?
He could spoke English. He spoke English out there.
Did you ever get to the point where you could have a conversation with him?
I never did. I just took straightly to business. Put him in the PW camp at night, and in the morning I'd come down and tell him what they had to do for the day, and at night he'd tell me what they did, and I'd go down and check the work, and that's all it was. If you're a PW, gone at night. I never drank coffee or chatted with him. No, I had no desire. Some of them guys are pretty. When we went to Germany, they were still pushing them off the street, wouldn't give way for them on the street at all, on the sidewalks.
Because that's always the curiosity to me, is when you sit down and talk to them person to person, if you find out that
they have family too.
Yeah.
Some of them were pretty arrogant. You could tell they were biting their lip, but this guy was more like a school teacher. The major I dealt with. Of course, he was an signal corps type. He was probably educated, because most of the people in there had pretty well educated. But he to me, he was more like a school teacher when I talked to him.
Did you ever keep touch any of your crew or anything like that, or once you?
Yes, I met after the war. I lost the co-pilot. We didn't get along too well, the crew. He was a major's son, and as soon as the war ended, he worked the deal and got back home immediately. The rest of us were waiting around for points to get home, and I've looked up. My bombardier is still alive, and he lives in Queens, New York. He got out and finished college and was a salesman for a drug company, and my 19-year-old navigator went back and went to Harvard and Yale and became a corporation lawyer. And I visited him in New York, and he had a whole suite of offices in one of those skyscrapers, about on the 44th floor. And I'll never forget, I came back, and he met me. Both him and the bombardier met me when I came back in 47. And his father took us out to dinner, and his father owned about 3 plants. He made preheaters for tractors. And he said, "Foster," he said, "you took good care of my son over there." I did too, because he'd get the laundry done. He'd give him 3 packs of cigarettes instead of 1. And anyway, he said, "I got a job for you." He said, "You can be my personal pilot, and I got 5 plants. I want you to be a pilot salesman in these plants." I said, "Geez, I'm sorry, Mr. Jetter, but I got accepted a regular commission in the Army. And he said, "You're going to stay in the Army?" He said, "Why, you're nothing but a bunch of dressed up bums in peacetime." You don't have to tell the school kids that, I guess.
Did your navigator ever learn navigation?
He was, well, no, he didn't. No, I can remember after the war when we went on, they gave us an airplane to go on a sightseeing tour of Germany. That's when we reviewed all the, and we went across the Alps. And he said, "Here, we could go through here." And I went down between the rocks and I looked, and we were going into a dead end. And I started, and I told him, and he said, "Oh, yeah, you better get out of here." And I peeled the airplane around, and I wasn't quite making it. So I dropped about 20 degrees of flaps, and the old airplane just came around, and we got out of that hole. And he was kind of a smart one. I can remember him taking off one day, and he says, I said, "Give me a heading." And he says, "What heading do you want?" I got 360 of them, you know. And I said, "If you don't give me the right one, you're going to walk back." I never trusted him. He always told me he had them. On every mission, he said, "Well, I got a course for Switzerland. So if we get into any trouble, we can go to Switzerland and get interned." And I think that was in his plan.
I heard that there was a certain point where they took that map out of the maps. So that,
I don't know.
To one guy that got hit over Germany, and that's where they said, "Do you want to put it down in Germany or Switzerland?" And they all said Switzerland, and then the navigator called up and said, "Where's Switzerland?" Luckily, the navigator had gone to Wazoo, so he kind of figured out looking at the landmass, and that's where they ended up as a prisoner of war, was in Switzerland. So,
Yeah. He did the same thing in Ireland.
is that right?
Yeah, Ireland never joined the war.
Oh yeah.
The Republic of Ireland. I went over to Ireland here about 3 years ago to a family reunion, and I remember they said, "Here's where a B-24 came in, and they took up and saved the crew in the end of this lake and everything else." I said, "Well, how long did you keep them interred?" "Oh, what's that? What was that?" And they played dumb on that one. Maybe they didn't know it's a different generation.
Pretty funny. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, well, I hope you can use some of it. You can cut it out whenever you want.
That's what we're doing. I mean, we're collecting a full